Well, good morning. This is the Lou Rockwell Show, and how great to have as our guest Mr. Peter Schiff. Peter is the president of Euro-Pacific Capital, the great prophet of the bust we've recently gone through, or still going through. Thank goodness there are so many hilarious and inspiring YouTubes of Peter talking about exactly what was going to happen, people making fun of him for it, and of course, he turned out to be right. He's the author of a number of bestsellers, the little book of Bull Moves in Bear Markets, Crash Proof, How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse, How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes. And he's got another bestseller that's due out in May, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, How to Save Yourself and Your Country. So, Peter, tell us about The Real Crash.
Well, first of all, let's hope it's a bestseller. It actually isn't out yet, so it hasn't sold any copies.
That's my prediction.
You could actually order your advanced copies now on Amazon.
We will link to it, and yes, we urge people, of course, to advance order it, absolutely.
Yeah, sure. They don't even charge you until they ship it out, but I think if we get a lot of advance orders, it can jump up on the bestseller list and maybe get noticed by somebody.
Exactly right.
I'm hoping to get my first review by an actual reviewer. I've yet to have any of my books reviewed. I've had, people in the financial industry or on television. We've got about 10 reviews up on the Amazon site. You can read what other people have said about the book, but I've never actually had a book review my book.
Peter, you're a dangerous heretic. Of course you haven't had the regular people review. Your ideas are supposed to be suppressed, not discussed.
Yes, well, unfortunately, the real crash is actually something that I also predicted in my earlier books. It just hasn't happened yet. A lot of people think that the crash I was predicting is the one we had in 08 and 09, and while I would say I did forecast that event or those events, I didn't believe that was the real crash. Back then, I still believed that the real crash was going to happen as a result of what the government was going to do in response to the earlier crash. And unfortunately, there again, the government has pretty much done everything I feared they would do. And so I think they've set the stage for the real crash, which is going to be something that is similar to what is playing out now in Europe, only on a bigger scale. We're going to have our own sovereign debt problem where the dollar is plunging, bond prices are plunging, interest rates are rising, there are no more bailouts. The government is either forced to default on its debt and restructure, or the Fed prints the dollar into oblivion. But either way, there's going to be a huge crisis, and certainly hyperinflation is worse than a default with a restructuring. But either way, there's going to be a lot of sacrifices that are going to have to be made, particularly by those who are living off the government. They're collecting a check from the government either because they're living off of an entitlement or they work for the government. They're going to have to accept dramatically reduced compensation or no compensation at all, and they're going to have to find jobs in the private sector. And this is what's going to happen. And I think a lot of other Americans are going to see the value of their savings and their incomes collapse as we have higher inflation, and more Americans are going to be struggling to survive even if they still have jobs.
Peter, aren't we already beginning to see the higher inflation in terms of, I don't mean in terms of money printing, which of course has been vast and unprecedented, but in terms of rising prices?
Well, I see it, and most people see it. Ben Bernanke doesn't see it, despite the fact that he told Ron Paul he does his own grocery shopping.
I don't believe that.
Well, maybe he doesn't look at the prices when he shops. He just goes, and just swipes his credit card and doesn't even bother to look. But, the interesting thing is, Ben Bernanke doesn't even care if gas prices go up or food prices go up. As long as the personal consumption expenditure index is showing 2% or lower, or maybe even a little bit higher, he doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him. I mean, we could be paying $10 a gallon for gasoline. We can be eating dog food because we can't afford people food, but as long as he's got that number that says there's no inflation, he's sticking with it. That's his story. He's sticking to it.
Peter, you outlined what I found to be in many ways a wonderful vision of people who work for the government, get checks from the government after actually having to go to work. But how much chance is there? I mean, what are the dynamics of a situation like this, of the crisis, which of course I agree with you that this crisis is upon us and going to get worse, when the state has got its back against the wall? What about the choice of just crushing the people even more? Can they get away with that, or will they not be able to get away with it?
Well, I mean, when you're talking about austerity, like even looking in Greece, the austerity is that government workers have to get by with less It's not austerity for the taxpayers who are having a burden lifted off their back. It's the people who have been living off this money have to sacrifice, and it's about time. And, part of the austerity in Greece is a 20% reduction in minimum wage. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. In fact, it would be better if they eliminated the minimum wage. The fact that they have to agree to it reluctantly because of from Europe is pushing it on them, well, good. I mean, it's sound policy. The lower the better. And again, getting rid of it completely would be a good thing, because if they don't reduce wages in Greece, then they're going to get reduced anyway, because they're going to go back to the drachma and they're going to print so many of them that the wages aren't going to buy anything. So I'd rather earn a smaller quantity of euros than an infinite quantity of worthless drachma. But we're going to have to deal with that too in America. But it's not austerity for everybody. If we really shrink the government, we can also lower the tax burden on the people who are pulling the wagon. The people who are riding in it are going to have a tough time because they got to get out and push, but then it lightens the burden on the people who are currently pulling it. And if we can get the government out of education, get the government out of health care, we can see big reductions in some of the major expenses that a lot of Americans have, like college tuition and health care costs. So there are a lot of benefits from getting the government out of the economy.
Peter, as we know, a lot of what's happening in Europe is in order to bail out the banks. But can the banks actually be bailed out? I mean, is their situation so disastrous that it's actually impossible to bail them out? Although so far, of course, they seem to be in control. There's a bank-appointed guy as Prime Minister of Greece and a bank-appointed guy as Prime Minister of Italy, and I guess we're going to see more of that. But can they actually pull that off?
Well, in the long run, I think a lot of the banks that have been bailed out are going to fail. Certainly the ones in the United States are going to fail eventually. But in the short run, a lot of the people working for the banks are able to make a lot of money that they otherwise wouldn't have made if we let some of these banks go out of business and allow those that remain to restructure. But the banks in America that we bailed out, they're still on artificial life support from the Fed. If the Fed raises interest rates, they're going to fail, which is why they're not doing it. They're living off of the cheap money. They've got a spread where they borrow from the Fed and loan to the Treasury and loan into the mortgage market and make money. But eventually rates have to go up. And if they don't go up, then the value of the money they're making is going to be worthless. So, the losses are coming one way or another. We can change the form where the losses, are distributed, and we can make certain people bear larger proportions of the losses than others. But the losses are there, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger the Federal Reserve delays the day of reckoning.
Peter, as you know, in the general theory, Keynes famously said that interest rates can and should be pushed to zero, which looks like, of course, what Bernanke and the rest of them are doing. What are the effects of this? What are the long-term and short-term economic effects of this kind of crazy interest rate policy by the central bank?
Well, the interest rate policy is badly distorting the economy, just like, any attempt to fix a price. You always want markets to set prices. You want to get price discovery. You want supply and demand to meet, and you want resources and prices to reflect, that optimization that you're going to get in a market economy. And so what happens is the Federal Reserve, instead of letting the market set the price of money, which is interest rates, the Federal Reserve just artificially imposes a price that it thinks we should have, and then the market has to react to that fixed price. And I would argue that probably the most important price in a market economy is the interest rate, because it affects almost everything we do. And that's really where you want to make sure you get it right. If we ever want market discovering the price, it would be in interest rates. But we don't have that. We have the government dictating a price. And, of course, the price they're setting is much too low, obviously. We know it's too low and not too high. Exactly where interest rates should be, I don't know, but much higher than zero. But by putting them this low, we distort resource allocations, we distort savings and investment and consumption patterns throughout the whole economy. People do things that they otherwise wouldn't have done had we had an accurate interest rate. Capital and resources are allocated in ways that they wouldn't be allocated if we had a true rate of interest. And so we're doing all these, distorting the economy, we're creating all these problems. And eventually interest rates have to rise, and when they do, we have to correct all the mistakes that occurred because they were too low. And the longer they keep them low, the bigger the mistakes are that we have to correct. And people are always going to say, well, then we'll just keep them low forever, problem solved. Well, you can't do that because then the dollar is worthless. You can't keep them low forever because then the Fed has to keep printing and buying up all the bonds, and eventually you have hyperinflation. So to avoid hyperinflation, we will eventually have to have very high interest rates, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences. Because just imagine, we are so leveraged up as a society right now. We've got a $15, $16 trillion national debt financed with T-bills. We've got all these banks levered up with long-term assets that have low yields, and they're borrowing from the Fed. The government, our whole society depends on this cheap money. The housing market is barely afloat with the lowest mortgage rates in history. What's going to happen when rates go up? This whole thing falls apart.
I thought of you the other day, Peter, when I heard Obama say, isn't it terrible that the price of college education keeps going up, and therefore he's going to have even more subsidies for a college education?
Well, of course. It's a never-ending cycle. The more we subsidize it, the more expensive it gets. What Obama needs to do is say, college is too expensive. We better pull the subsidies out so the price will come down. That's what needs to happen. In fact, it's so expensive, it's not even worth going. I would say that the vast majority of Americans at this point would be better off skipping college altogether. The degree is not worth what it costs. Certainly if you finance it and you have to pay the money over time with interest. If we had a free market in education, yes, fewer Americans would go to college. And that would be a good thing because I think we have too many Americans in college that shouldn't be there. They should be doing something else. They should be concentrating on developing skills and talents that you don't get in college. But yes, we still need some people to go to college, but they shouldn't pay a fortune for the privilege. They should be able to work their way through college like my dad did before the government got involved, when colleges actually had to compete for students, just like computer companies compete with us to sell laptops. When businesses compete and people shop around, they get a good deal. They get lower prices and better quality. But when the government comes in and gives 18-year-olds a blank check to borrow on the credit of the United States to pay whatever some college wants to charge, well, then they're going to get a fancy gymnasium. They're going to get fancy off-campus housing. They're going to pay for all kinds of stuff that they really don't need, but who cares because the government is paying for it.
I can't believe I actually agreed with Rick Santorum. I can't stand Rick Santorum, but I liked what he said about it's crazy that the federal government wants to send every kid to college, and it's all demeaning of jobs and that don't involve college.
Yeah, but of course, when they called him on it, he backtracked. He couldn't defend the position because it's almost heresy.
It is heresy
to say this because it's all this teachers' unions and the educational establishment that benefits from selling our children down the river. We're ripping off our kids to support this complex of education, and I don't even use the word education. I put it in quotes because it's not even education. It is more like indoctrination. They're not really learning anything. Just because they have a degree doesn't mean they know anything. Just because your kid spends 6 years partying at fraternities and getting drunk and throwing up, and then when he graduates, they stick a diploma on him, and he's got a bachelor's degree in sociology or comparative philosophy. It doesn't mean he knows anything. In fact, a lot of people that go to school or go to college, all they do is party, they have fun, and they cram for the exams, and even after they take the exam, a day later, they forgot everything they crammed for. All they're trying to do is get a diploma, not any knowledge. Yes, there are some people that actually learn stuff. I remember we used to make fun of those kids when we were in college, because I was I was a business major. We made fun of the people that were studying at night and weren't going to parties. But they were those were the ones that should have been in college. I should have been in college. I didn't learn. It was like I could have skipped it. It didn't help my career. But yes, there were people that were studying hard sciences, that were computer science, engineering, that actually were learning stuff that helped them, get a job. I didn't learn any of that stuff. I took the easy way out because I wanted to have fun while I was in college. I wanted to have a good time before I had to get a job. And that's what most of the people I was hanging out with were doing. But if the government got out of it, then people would only go to college if it was worth the money because it was their money they were spending. And to the extent that you could get a loan, if you would even need one, no bank would be dumb enough to lend you money to get a philosophy major. They would make sure you majored in something decent, and they would also probably make sure you had good grades and that you were going to a good school because they would actually want to get paid back. See, right now, the banks don't give a damn if you can ever pay them back. They're going to get the money anyway from the government. And, of course, to make matters worse, the government has now taken the banks out of it completely. The government is directly doing the loans. Because according to Obama, when we have the banks involved, we had profits, and profits are bad. And so if the government can socialize student lending and take the